Va.
And I won't go into too much detail, but the Akazi Venezuela will seek to restore democracy and normalcy in Venezuela. And there is a warrant for the arrest of Maduro. So it is legal to remove him from power.
Bienvenidos a El Búnker Digital, tu lugar seguro de información. Hoy 3 de noviembre del 2024, Erik Prince, el ex militar y empresario, va a dar un anuncio importante en contra de Nicolás Maduro Moro. Justamente esto en la entrevista y entrevistado por Anthony Pamploni, donde hablan de distintos temas, pero en concreto sobre la actualidad de Venezuela y Nicolás Maduro, donde reiteramos va a dar un anuncio muy importante en su contra. Justamente en estos momentos vamos a pasar a la entrevista, donde está en inglés, pero lo hemos subtitulado para que lo puedan leer de manera más cómoda. Justamente en estos momentos lo ponemos a continuación.
We have a very special episode for you. We have Erik Prince, the former founder of Blackwater and the current founder of the Unplugged Phone. This conversation is wide-ranging. We talk about geopolitics, we talk about American security, the national debt, government inefficiency, and what Erik thinks about the various conflicts that are happening around the world. Erik is one of the foremost experts on warfare. He's got a ton of experience both serving in the Navy SEALs, but also building Blackwater. And he is a great reader of American history, world history, military history, and he's got unique thoughts that he shares throughout this conversation. This is one of the conversations that reminds me why I started this show. It allows me to talk to interesting people who have interesting ideas, and it makes me think more critically about the world, and this conversation does not disappoint. Here is my latest episode. It is with Erik Prince, the former founder of Blackwater and the current founder of the Unplugged Phone. America is kind of the tale of two stories. We have the greatest nation in the world. We live in the safest, most prosperous time in human history. There's a lot of things we can point to that would give you an optimistic view of the future. At the same time, you can look at America and you can tell a story of a crumbling empire that seems to be almost collapsing on its own success. People don't want to defend the ideals, ethos, and values that have gotten us here. You're very unique, I think, in that you have an understanding of history, you've got opinions about the future, and you've been very involved in a number of the major kind of developments in the country, both geopolitically and economically over the last couple decades. And so when you look at where we are today, do you have an optimistic view of the future, or do you have a pessimistic view of maybe an alarm sounding that a lot of things need to change?
I have I'm kind of an eternal optimist. And as I look at what really made America, it was breakthroughs of the private sector. It was not no. I will have to say, I think I really have to give credence, maximum kudos to the founding fathers. When you look at the Constitution and you look at the Bill of Rights and their ability to see the problems of the relationship between state and citizens, and what was what other document did they have to reference? The Magna Carta, but yet they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and seeing how government always grows, government always enriches itself, whether you're a monarchist or a federalist, and they put all those checks and balances, assuming and understanding that people were always going to grow stupid. And the fact that they laid out that kind of framework. And as I look at what countries in the world have really prospered versus and long-term have prospered, there's fundamental underpinnings of the infrastructure of their governance and of the people that embrace that governance. And when you move away from that and you dilute that down, you get the crumbling empire. Rome, right? The Roman Empire grew and prospered. That was not one that was really built on individual rights, as we would. That was definitely an empire of conquest. And when they kind of ran out of conquest, it ran out of gas. And of course, they debased their currency and made all kinds of bad decisions. But, for a while, as it was growing, the elites were engaged and vested in the society. Remember when the Battle of Cannae happened, the biggest loss in, I think one of the biggest single day losses in military history, 80,000 people killed by sword in a morning. When the Roman Senate met a couple weeks later, it was 40% undermanned. Why? Because the elites had actually showed up. Now America's problems grow from, we have too much government. We have way too much government spending, and things have gotten way out of whack. The 10th Amendment has been ignored, right? Remember, the 10th Amendment says any power not specifically delegated to the federal government remains the sole purview of the states. Because we've gotten away from a healthy rivalry between the state power and federal power, and when the federal government can literally print unlimited money, as we have, and now we're 35 trillion in debt, you enrich and engorge a class of people that the exact stuff that the founding fathers were warning about. And so we have to trim that down to size. I'm hoping that this election has consequences that will actually trim it down to size, because if it's not, then it's going to be a really ugly transition. Because I think you're going to have more of possibly a Weimar-like transition, not a smooth line. Well, look, putting any nation on a diet is never pleasant, right? Anybody that starts fasting or starts, because America is actually physically fat and our government is fat, but we either have to do it the disciplined way or in a very chaotic, ugly way.
There almost seems to be this like chicken or egg problem. The government has grand ambitions. They want to do all these things for their citizens, even if it's ill-placed, hope. The
road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Correct.
That is the first thing that people have to remember.
But there's also the government spending problem. And so I've always wondered, is it the intentions of, hey, we want to help the people, that's why we spend a lot of money? Or is it, if you give a man a money printer, he's going to print a bunch of money and then look around and say, well, where do I put the money? Right? Like, if you have to kind of get to the root solution.
Politicians will always respond and pander to a constituency to get elected. And once they're there and once a program is started, I think I just saw a study, there's like 1.8 new government programs per year since the founding in 1789. And there's not really been a culling or a sunsetting of a lot of that stuff. And so all of that is expanded and compounded, and no force has had the discipline or the power to actually curtail that down. So you look at our healthcare system, look at how much we spend, and clearly we spend way too much. The amount of doctors has not really changed, but the amount of healthcare administrators responding to regulation and nonsense around that. And it's almost uncompetitive behavior because of those well-intentioned regulations. If a lot of the government just said, just get the hell out of the way, I think you'd find it surprising. I always compare the price of LASIK to the price of any kind of government subsidized or government regulated surgery process, and it's night and day, right? Because LASIK price goes down every year. The lounges are beautiful. It's on time because it's private pay. It's not government pay. And that's the root of the problem.
It seems like that government pay, insurance pay is a incentive system that is pervasive throughout our society where problems exist. So you have healthcare, you have student loans. I mean, you can just go down the line.
Everywhere that government touches, it inflates costs because people are spending money that's not theirs. I even noticed it. I have a contract manufacturing business. So we make stuff for industrial power and very, very straight commercial, super competitive markets versus a defense market. And those costs are easily 30 to 50 to 100% more just because government touches it and it screws it up.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to like a material problem that I think a lot of people care about, but also we can use as an example to explain how some of this works is the southern border. It feels like for years there were people who were always concerned with or focused on securing the border, whatever that meant, call it over the last couple of decades. But in the last 4 years or so, there's been an explosion of these border crossings, very much determined or described as just an open border. And it feels like now there is a conversation that, hey, this is a problem. One side of the political aisle has been saying that for 4 years. I think the other side of the political aisle, whether they actually mean it or not, is starting to say, hey, we want to close down the border. What is the ramifications of that open border in terms of there's safety, there's economic strain, there's healthcare strain, there's all these kind of almost like knock-on effects of a single decision of, hey, we're going to open the border, seems to be one of the biggest contributing factors to kind of the decline of American society.
Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I would argue, off of a, hey, we're going to lock down the border seriousness. And yes, America is a nation of immigrants. I'm Dutch. My family came from the Netherlands in 1915. But there was a time in the 1920s, I think 1924, they curtailed it and basically slowed it down. And it gave almost 20 years for some homogenization, right? For the melting pot to work, to the point that Italian speaking kids from Manhattan went to Italy and fought for America. Imagine. But they identified that strongly as America. We don't have anywhere near that kind of national identity right now. So yes, the southern border issue is not an organized crime. It's an industrialized crime. There are actual travel agencies in Dubai. I just spoke to a couple of them last week, where there's travel packages, immigration travel packages for people coming out of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan to fly on Turkish Airways through Istanbul. They drop them in Latin America, and they get linked into a bus system to bus them up through Mexico. It's ridiculous. So
somebody is coming out of like Bangladesh and they say, I want to go to America. And they literally get in touch with this travel agency. Yep. And they're paying, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of dollars, whatever it is.
Yeah, they buy the ticket for a couple grand one way.
Mm-hmm. But the travel agency is coordinating this.
Absolutely.
And then when they get on the ground, they're getting told, like, there's the border, go.
And they literally get handed off almost like a tour operator, right? I mean, if you go to Greece and you're going to go on a tour, you land, you get met by a bus, you go on your tour to meet the ship. In this case, you land somewhere in Latin America, you get met by a bus and you're bussed up in, and they tell you, okay, they hand you off to this coyote. It's industrialized. There was enough pressure from the Trump administration last time to curtail a lot of that nonsense. All of the early Biden changes obviously lift that off. And so it's been a runaway train since. Again, that's fixable. But when you flood a society with that many people that were not born, and then you have a welfare system which reinforces almost ghettoization of people where they're receiving welfare benefits, they're not necessarily working, and their foreign language is now accommodated in the schools, right? The whole premise of a public education system is to be a common bottom few rungs of the ladder so that everybody has a fair chance. And that's another problem of government schools have really severely underperformed what the private sector offers. So again, without sounding like too much of a hardcore libertarian, which I guess I am, everything government touches, it tends to screw up.
How do we go from government has its hands in all of these different industries to it not having its hand? Is it just we need a administration to go in and be very committed to kind of ripping this out and firing people, or what does that transition
look like? Two things on the immigration reform. Obviously, big diplomatic pressure on Mexico to knock it off. Second, but you have a very left wing, even more so than AMLO president there now, an actual communist. But still possible to pressurize that. Two, implement actual pressure to make it an unpleasant place to be if you're not in America legally. So you're not banked, you're not going to school, employers are not employing you, and so a lot of people will go home. Two, there's a lot of people that have committed significant crimes that final deportation orders have already been administered. It's like 1.6 million of those still floating around society.
Wait, say this again. There's 1.6 million people
with final deportation orders have been issued already, and they haven't been deported yet.
Is that a manpower like?
That's a government competence issue. Hey, you see well, I remember in like 2005, the Bush administration then was talking about adding some Border Patrol agents. And we at Blackwater got called before Congress to testify as a friendly one because they wanted to train these new Border Patrol agents. And I remember the Border Police, the CBP came with a figure of like $180,000 to train a new border guy and our price was like 40 or 50. And so Congress was trying to understand why we could do it for so little. And that's just the private sector versus government. It's a different cost thing. So when you look at how does the next administration deal with deportation of even people that are the 1.6 million that every court has already ruled they do not belong here. They've committed crimes while here. They need to go. Fine. I think that's more of an argument for the private sector to deal with that, deputized.
Yeah, part of what I kind of go back to in some of these situations is there's so much, just government waste that occurs. It's very hard for them to give up power.
Of course.
Right. And, human nature, right, is, hey, I have a job. I don't want to lose my job. Give me more money, give me more budget, give me more whatever.
I have butted up against that every encounter with the federal government. Every bureaucracy hates competition. They will close ranks and screw the private sector every way they can. Elon Musk is feeling that as well. Mm-hmm. I am firmly convinced that NASA issued that license for him to finally do that test and to grab the rocket out of thin air because they thought he was going to fail right then before the election.
So let's talk a little bit as to Blackwater and how you were able to win these contracts and serve the country with a very unique, I think, kind of employment model in terms of like who you were actually recruiting and how you were able to do it at a lower cost. Because I do think that there is parallels between you and the global war on terror and what you guys were able to accomplish and Elon and some of the things that he's trying to do because he's butting up against the same kind of machine that you were. And so maybe there's things Elon can learn from your experiences that he could apply now.
We butted up against the same thing, and I've used this argument. I was born in the summer of 1969, the summer of Woodstock and Apollo 11. And if someone said that 50 years later, the only way the U.S. gets to the International Space Station is on a Russian rocket or on a contractor rocket, they would have laughed you out of Johnson Space Center. But that's exactly the case. And we butted up against that as Blackwater, saying, well, you can't be doing that because it's inherently governmental. It's too hard. Only government can do that. And I would call nonsense on that, as he is very ably demonstrated. Blackwater started as a training facility. SEAL teams had used private facilities really since the 1970s. The SEAL team in the 90s, when I was in, our ammunition budget for 2,000 SEALs was the same amount as the 150,000 man Marine Corps. Right, so we had a lot of ammo, took training very seriously, but no one had done a private facility on an industrial scale. And you say, well, why would you do that when there's government bases? Because government bases are very bureaucratic and very slow. And so when you have a platoon going through a workup, you didn't have time for a lot of the nonsense delays. And so I was in the usual position of having been in the SEALs, my father's success. I kind of knew what they needed, and I did it. I got out in 96, bought the land, and built it. And at the same time, I had taken over my father's original business made die-cast machines, big machines that squeeze a mold and makes aluminum or magnesium castings. And I've taken it through a lean transformation really based on the Toyota production system. So we took a bunch of cost out and designed out costs and big labor productivity improvements, and especially lean flow. And as I'm laying out Blackwater, I'm thinking, what does the military do? It recruits, vets, equips, trains, deploys, and supports people. We built a machine to do that, and that worked. And so as the company grew to do not just training, but security and aviation and logistics and medical, and we could process tens of thousands of people. We built an air wing of 73 aircraft of our company-owned aircraft to do that. And because we knew our costs and we viciously
Thing about your story is that one of my favorite entrepreneurs in all of history is a gentleman named Suleiman Olian, who comes out of Saudi Arabia. He worked for what at the time eventually became Aramco, and he worked in the warehouse. And what was so fascinating about it is because he worked in the warehouse and he was seeing what products are coming in, what are going out. He's very in tune with kind of the business, the unit economics, the suppliers, all this. And they decided they're going to have to build the pipelines to let's get the oil out of here. And so they create a program that does two things. One, we're going to have to use a vendor-based system. We can't do it all ourselves. We're going to have to contract out to people. But two is we're going to give the advantage either in the contract or in the pricing to Saudi-owned businesses. So he basically walks into work one day and he says, hey, I'm putting my 2 weeks in, but I know that you guys have a contract out for, I think it started with some trucks. And he says, I'm going to go start that company. Why don't you give me the contract? You guys know me, you trust me, etc. I'm going to go and I'm going to go build this out. Long story short, if you fast forward, he creates something called the Olean Group, and he ends up being probably the largest construction kind of conglomerate in the Middle East, simply because every time a contract came up, he was a trusted source. He had a proven track record of keeping costs low, delivering on time, etc. He keeps getting contract for contract for contract. What's fascinating about him is he was a businessman, and so he was always fascinated with the United States. And he constantly wanted to figure out how can he get access to financing. No one in the Middle East was providing financing, especially not to, kind of one of their countrymen. And so he started talking to American banks, and they said, hey, look, we'd love to give you money. You've got a great business, but you have no collateral in the U.S. And so Suleiman ended up starting to put money in U.S. banks so that he could just buy some stocks. So he had collateral so he could get financing. Turns out he becomes one of the largest investors in the U.S. markets of anyone in the Middle East, simply because he did it for a really long time. He's making a lot of money and doing this whole thing. I always think of that story as essentially the private market kept going to, in that case, Aramco, but could have been the government, and said, what do you need now?
Yep.
Give me the order. I'll go do it. And I think the Blackwater story is so much of, okay, you need a training site. Let's build the training site, do that well. Okay, what's the next thing you need? And you just kind of continued. They almost like led you to what the business was, which really is an entrepreneurial story of just listening to the customer.
I said, I constantly preach to our team, there is no guarantee that we will exist next year. We are not a line item in the budget. We have to convince our customers to let us solve their problems. Mm-hmm. And that was our business mantra, I guess.
Given the lessons that you learned at Blackwater, when you think of Elon today, are there things that you think he should do that maybe would make his life a little bit easier?
What I wish I had done much earlier is diversify the business away from the government. Because the political nature of supporting a military at war, right? The anti-war left went after troops in Vietnam and in the Iraq, the whole GWAT thing. They love to go after contractors and they love to hate me. He was very wise to build a space business, but he did that. NASA was his first vendor, but he got smart building his own rockets. And what did he do? He built a Starlink fleet of satellites. Spectacular. And that is all private sector. And government regulates and constricts them, but that is a very big leverage point that he carries.
I mean, you already see it, right? The Russia-Ukraine conflict, there's been multiple times where people on both sides have yelled and screamed about Starlink access. You see, obviously, the natural disaster in North Carolina where Starlink's being provided. He just keeps running up to it everywhere.
Indispensable vendor.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we were Blackwater was the indispensable vendor in a lot of places because we would show up. I mean, 6 months ago, Sudan as a country melted down. There was 16,000 Americans and they needed to be evacuated. And Wall Street Journal called me and said, are you involved in evacuations? I said, no, I'm sitting this one out. I said, but wouldn't it be nice if there was an American company that owned its own aircraft that would go fly in there? Because nobody could fly aircraft in. Why? Because there's missiles flying around. So nobody wants to, all the insurers cancel. So we were self-insured. We would fly into those places. So yeah, I'm happy. I'm so happy for his success.
I don't think people quite understand in these conflict zones. I recently talked to two different people. One came out of the intelligence world. Another was a former special operator. And both of them in different ways have been involved in going and rescuing people, whether it was out of Ukraine during the Russian invasion. There were situations in Palestine, et cetera. And take, for example, this one group that was going and getting people out of Ukraine. they're not talking about like, hey, let me call the person and, hey, go walk to the airport and we'll make sure that you get on the commercial flight. These guys are going in, they're staging vehicles, they have communications, they have manpower, they have weapon. I mean, a very, very complex logistical operation. And as I was talking to him, one thing just kept hitting myself in the head was it used to be that if you had an American passport, the U.S. military would always come and get you. And it feels like today that may not actually be true.
Unfortunately, that is very true. As an American, they'll tax you anywhere you are in the world, but they'll not necessarily rescue you. But again, I contrast Haiti in May of this year. There was 2 young missionaries on their first mission in Port-au-Prince, newly married, and they're on the way back from a youth event. And they get attacked by a gang. They hardpoint in their house. And the husband has an M4 and he's holding off this gang in a gunfight. The wife is on the phone pleading for help, calling the U.S. Embassy, just 1 mile away. Calling and calling, asking for help. Calling the RSO, anybody at the embassy. And they do nothing. Okay? They didn't send, there's probably 12 Marines assigned. Nobody left the confines of the U.S. Embassy to drive 1 mile to help 2 American kids, missionaries in grave danger. Of course, they're overwhelmed, brutalized, murdered. Terrible. And that's just not how it's supposed to be if you're a U.S. citizen calling help for your government. And I contrast that with a little known story. At the end of, it was October of 2020. So a month before the election, a 27-year-old missionary on his farm in Niger, kidnapped by some jihadis. And the jihadis are driving him south to link up with Boko Haram. U.S. is watching with drones based at a base in Niger, which you've also been kicked out of. I think that the Biden administration has lost 9 embassy locations. Nobody talks about that. You talk about
when you say lost, as in they were disinvited,
withdrawn, closed. Yeah. Sudan, Ukraine, Afghanistan, onward. Anyway, so the jihadis are moving this guy south, and Trump, like 9 days before the election, authorizes a rescue. So the JSOC guys mount up, they move him to Spain, C-130, free fall in, they land, they go in, and the jihadis were bedded down with the one hostage. They find the hostage, secure him, kill everybody else. There was one guy off taking a leak. They let him live. Don't fuck with the Americans. Can you imagine the 27-year-old kid who goes to sleep surrounded by jihadis in the middle of the desert, and he wakes up to space aliens looking at him? Because they're not coming with 2 tubes, they're coming with 4, right? Canvas 21s. And just say, hey, we're Americans, we're here to get you home. That's how it's supposed to be. That's why we spend $750 billion.
I do think.
So it's really dangerous for us to equate buying stuff with buying capability. And if you don't have the willingness to engage when you're at the threshold, and if you don't have the right leadership, that will make that decision, right? What does Clausewitz talk about? 2 kinds of courage to win a war. Individual soldiers' courage, you saw, we have a lot of that. But the moral courage of leaders to commit their people to an uncertain outcome, that's the problem. When you have an elite that has no skin in the game, that has no understanding of going to do a difficult thing in a dangerous place, and they become bureaucratic cowards, that's where it all breaks down.
So you're a very interesting person to talk to about this because I try to pay attention, I think, to society and understand the impact on the military, especially the pipeline in the military. And if I think of my experience, I went to Iraq in 2008, 2009. If you think of the things that happened after that, you had the bin Laden raid, which I think was highly celebratized, and people looked at it and said, hey, like that is America doing what America does.
Yep.
Right? We will find you and we will kill you if you are a bad person. If you look at the Captain Phillips rescue and kind of the famous shot off of a moving ship onto another moving ship, et cetera, again, like that is what America does. But then you have to.
But there's some nuance to that.
Okay.
And I think it makes my point exactly, because the rules of engagement that had been imposed by Team Obama was they could not take a shot unless there was an absolutely immediate threat to the hostage. And basically the on-scene commander got sick of waiting hour after hour after hour and nothing was happening. Finally said, he kind of reinterpreted the orders and took a shot. That's what finally resolved it.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually
a simultaneous shot of a couple of different snipers all shooting at the same time.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
It was moral courage of the on-scene leadership to say, enough of this shit.
Now, if we compare that to Benghazi, if we compare that to a number of different situations that have now become public, it feels like, again, the American passport, does it actually represent that they will come and get you? If people,
not just citizens, those are actual government employees in a bad place. Yeah, it's amazing. If you think of there's 750, 800 billion in the defense budget, probably 30 to 50 of that is directly related to CSAR, combat search and rescue. And the amount of options that were available in an aircraft carrier battle group with 85 aircraft on board, you had a C-130 with a special operations team, guns loaded, everything. That's their mission, doing commanders in extremis force out of Croatia. Other aircraft out of Sicily, F-16s at Sigonella, or out of Viano in Italy, and then V-22s in Rota, Spain. All those things, capability, no moral courage of the leaders to commit their people to an uncertain outcome, and the bureaucratic handholding and kumbaya decision in Washington, and people died from it, and it's a bad look. And what happened there is a microcosm of what happened in Afghanistan when you had, I think, pretty clear indication given by General Miller of what was going to happen, the last commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan, to say, if we pull the U.S. aircraft out and we're not bombing the Taliban anymore, it's going to go from they're grouping up in 5s and 10s and 50s to 200, 500, and 1,000. And that's what rolls over cities. And I called it 6 months before the actual collapse, and I was off by 2 weeks. But I based it just off of when I knew the fuel contract was ending. Because when they're not putting gas in U.S. aircraft, and they're not doing air support on, putting warheads on foreheads where they belong, it went bad.
So there's this famous story now, the Radisson Blu Hotel. I think it was in Somalia. There's a Delta Force operator.
No, that was in it's in Mali.
In Mali, okay.
Yep.
And I think that this is almost like the perfect example of what you're talking about, where for those that don't know, there were some terrorists that went into the Radisson Blu Hotel. They began shooting up. They light it on fire. Yep. There's American citizens in there. A mile, 2 miles away, there's a couple of Marines. There's a single Delta Force operator, and I think that there was some CIA personnel. And the way the story gets told by the Delta Force operator is basically he says, I'm going to get my kit and I'm going to go there. That's what I do. This is what I was trained to do. And I believe he was discouraged from going.
Of course.
Right? I believe the leadership basically said, I know you can hear gunshots. I know people are dying. I know that you are one of the most proficient warriors we've ever trained and put on the battlefield. But just sit down, stand down.
Sure. Even the guys that when Benghazi happened, and I contrast this because a lot of people love to dish on Blackwater. The 8 or 10 diplomatic security service government employees that were protecting the U.S. ambassador in Benghazi, how many rounds did they fire when the attack happened?
I don't know.
Zero. Okay. How is that possible? How is it possible that your protectee dies and you didn't fight back? Is that cowardice? Is it incompetence? I don't know. But if you want to criticize Blackwater for being too diligent, I'll take that criticism. But no one under our protection ever died. But then the agency contractors, not agency employees, agency contractors, many of whom used to work for me, heard the gunfire, were going to move to the sound of the gunfire to actually help Americans in danger, and they were told not to by their bureaucrat boss. And eventually they didn't listen, and they moved to help people that were in grave danger.
And put themselves in danger for doing so.
Sure. Yeah. Look, even in a little known story, I think in 2006 or 7, it was when the first special forces team started showing up in Mali, trying to work with the locals and building them. And we were hired, Blackwater was, to put a couple of aircraft there for medevac and logistics support. And we were flying little Casa 212s. It's like a little shrunk C-130. And they're out at this very remote base in the big Schmal winds, huge, powerful wind. And it literally ripped the aircraft off its tie-down points, damaged the aircraft and the wing, picked the tent up that the active duty Army SF guys were in and tossed it across the ground, killed one guy, broke a guy's spine and pelvis, 2 others with other fractures, and one guy had major internal bleeding. That was the one that was in real danger. And all their comm gear was trashed. So our guys got the SATCOM going in the busted airplane, called the other aircraft, which was 800, 1,000 miles away, said, we're stuffed here, help. And so the other Casa launches, and we'd been prevented from having night vision goggles for some stupid bureaucratic reason. And our 18 Delta contractor medic strapped himself to the floor of the aircraft. And then they land on a single set of Hummer headlights in the desert at night during a storm. Now, if you've ever flown in the desert at night, it's dark. It redefines what dark looks like. And they land, they recover, and this medic starts working this guy. Okay. And they put every bit of fluid into this wounded SF guy because his blood pressure was crashing. And they called ahead to Ouagadougou, which is where we were flying in, which is the capital of Burkina Faso, in case you're wondering, to do an emergency blood drive because we needed some kind of trusted blood. And second, to go get some certain pain meds. And so back they land, and this guy is now inflated, right? He's just distended. And the Air Force still hasn't shown up with any kind of emergency surgery capability. So our medic, moral courage, said, well, shit, I'm not going to let him die. He opens him up. He does field surgery on him, takes the organs out. Sure enough, finds the ruptured spleen, zip ties it, removes it, puts it in a baggie, puts the organs back in, closes him up, saves the guy's life. It's just fantastic. It's my second proudest professional moment.
What was the first?
I'll get to that. I was at Eric Olson's change of command. He was the first 4-star SEAL, taking charge of all of SOCOM. And I'm standing in line waiting to go in, and Admiral McCraven walks by, who is in charge of all special operations in Africa and in Europe. And he goes and he gives me a bear hug in uniform. He goes, that was some really sporty flying you guys did. I said, well, sir, that's why we have sporty pilots. And, but that's the kind of moral courage I love employing people like that to just find a way to get it done and win.
Mm-hmm. What was the first?
Speaking at the National War College in Washington. And, I got out of the Navy as a lieutenant. It was nothing. And all 300 colonels popped to attention. And I gave him the whole brief on what we're doing and why. And at the end of it, this guy came to me and he said, I was just in Baghdad as a commander, brigade commander. So he had 3,000-4,000 soldiers. He said at the top of the dashboards of their Humvees, they'd have the Blackwater call signs and frequencies because they knew that if the shit went bad, if they called the Blackwater guys, they would come immediately. No questions, no bureaucracy. I said, exactly what we want.
That is fantastic. If we bring it back to the United States, this moral clarity, this moral courage that you're talking about.
I gave him the whole brief on what we're doing and why. And at the end of it, this guy came to me and he said, I was just in Baghdad as a commander, brigade commander.
National debt that is
so completely 3,000-4,000 soldiers. He said at the top of the dashboards,
but accelerating.
Of their Humvees, they'd have the Blackwater call signs and frequencies.
Just in the month of October. What are the solutions that you think should be implemented?
Elon Musk is right about doing a massive culling of government bureaucracies. Mm-hmm. And that does two things. One, it's just the spend on the people, but two, having that many bureaucrats. It's like, what did Jefferson say in the Declaration of Independence about the king? He has set forth thousands of bureaucrats to eat out our substance. And the fact is, Washington is like 70% remote work now. So all the bureaucrats in the DC area, 70% of them don't even go into the office. So I'm not thinking there's a whole lot of productivity there, which is good, but let's give them a 1 year, 2 year severance, but let's just pare down massively.
How many, I don't know how many employees work for the federal government, but like what percentage do you think we could fire and not notice?
Well, there's millions of employees and millions of contractors as well that
50% of the U.S. government we could fire and not even notice?
70.
You think 70%?
Absolutely.
Wow.
Look, Elon Musk fired 80% of Twitter, and Twitter is better than ever.
Yeah.
If you think that after 200 and almost 50 years, the federal government couldn't go on a diet, adding that many programs. I mean, what I'm saying might be considered radical. We either do it in an organized way or it's going to be fed to us when the dollar collapses. The problem with that many bureaucrats, with all that funding and no accountability, is they make a lot of rules. And there's like 100,000 pages of new regulations come out every year with the force of law, which directly impedes and impairs people from starting a business, people from innovating, from creating. And you know who hurts the worst? The people at the bottom end of the spectrum. Okay. It doesn't hurt the BlackRocks and the Fortune 500 companies because they have the massive compliance programs and lawyers and all the rest. And they can ride out that kind of time delay. But for the guy or girl that comes up with a great idea in their garage to try to get it to market, and they're just constantly blocked by licensing, it's wrong. Okay. So headcount reduction, bureaucracy reduction, the fact that the Supreme Court did curtail the Chevron deference. That was like the 1984 case. They just overturned that about 6 months ago. That is a huge win. And so you'll see litigation from that starts to chop away at a runaway regulatory state. And 3, the inflation is caused by us, by government, especially just spending way too much money. And I would say the fourth, and certainly not the fourth in priority, there's a book that really affected my thinking. It's called The Myth of Capitalism. I encourage your readers to read it, or your viewers to watch it or to read it. It makes the case that we have massively overconsolidated American industry. And it is that cozy relationship between big business and government, which is happy for regulations because it blocks out
the ladder behind them.
Exactly. And it talks about like the average pay ratio, CEO to junior guy in 1972 was like 30 to 1. Now it's 360 to 1. Our CEOs have not gotten 12 times better since then. When you look at the overconsolidation in data, in search, in IT, in banking, in food processing, all these major industries, the regulatory state has driven the consolidation and the cartelization of many industries, including defense, and that needs to be broken up. The trust busting done effectively by the Teddy Roosevelt administration needs to be done again.
Let's talk about the history of America, because I think people actually may have.
On the way in here, you pointed out these captains of industry, phenomenal, right? They built it, but they also consolidated a lot, and they really restricted that. And what happened when Standard Oil was broken up? Rockefeller ended up making more money, but the competition brought by having multiple people coming to the table helped that innovation and speed.
What always is the paradox of Rockefeller in my mind is he's famous for this quote where he says, "I'd rather earn 1% off 100 people's effort than 100% off of just mine." But Standard Oil obviously was just one large company. When it broke up, then he still had ownership in many of the broken up components, and he did make more money. And so in a weird way,
Bien, amigos del Búnker Digital, justamente estamos escuchando una entrevista de el ex militar y empresario Erik Prince, Recordar que también esta entrevista es aproximadamente de 2 horas, pero justamente en estos momentos vamos a ir a la parte más importante y es donde toca el tema de Venezuela, la actualidad de Venezuela y de Nicolás Maduro. Nos trasladamos específicamente a ese momento para poder escucharlos de manera más precisa y holgada. En estos momentos los ponemos a continuación. Bien amigos del Búnker Digital, justamente hemos escuchado esta entrevista del ex militar y empresario Erik Prince, justamente en esa entrevista donde se trató distintos temas, pero más puntualmente y concretamente se llevó a cabo el tema de Venezuela, la actualidad de Venezuela y de Nicolás Maduro. También recordemos que Erik Prince es un mercenario estadounidense, fundador de la empresa Blackwater y es sin dudas una ficha destacada del candidato a la presidencia de Estados Unidos, Donald Trump. Actualmente impulsa un plan para desplegar en el territorio venezolano un ejército privado con la intención de atacar al presidente reelecto, Nicolás Maduro Moros. Según algunos portales internacionales, Prince continúa sumando y buscando inversión y apoyo político de partidos partidarios de Donald Trump, influyentes y exiliados venezolanos ricos para tal operación. En reuniones privadas en los Estados Unidos y Europa, Erik Prince también es recordado por la fracasada Operación Gedeón, cuando fueron contratados en nombre del líder opositor venezolano Juan Guaidó. Cabe destacar que Erik Prince, de 55 años, es un ex integrante de los SEAL, fuerza élite de toda la estructura militar de la Marina norteamericana, con los que participó en muchas misiones desestabilizadoras desde Haití hasta Yugoslavia. Justamente en la amenaza ya cantada, este personaje se volvió parte de la tendencia ya casi Venezuela, luego de compartir una publicación mediante su cuenta de X, antiguamente Twitter, donde se visualiza un video que anuncia el 16 de septiembre como una fecha importante, creando la zozobra en el país. Estén atentos todos los venezolanos amantes de la libertad, pronto habrá más. Este es el mensaje que acompaña al clip que compartió Prince mediante su red social. Igualmente, este ex militar se ha mostrado activo con respecto a la situación política que atraviesa Venezuela y manifestó en varias publicaciones su apoyo a la líder opositora María Corina Machado. Recordemos que en agosto de este mismo año dijo que esta misma red que sí elevan la recompensa a 100 millones de dólares por Nicolás Maduro, Diosdado Cabello y todo su régimen, solo tienen que sentarse y esperar a que suceda la magia. Estas amenazas de Prince ya las han respondido desde el gobierno revolucionario. De hecho, en julio de este año, el embajador representante permanente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela ante la ONU, Samuel Moncada, destacó en un post en su cuenta de X: en Venezuela la lucha es contra el fascismo mundial y la clara mayoría de nuestro pueblo está dispuesto a dar batalla por nuestra independencia. Por otra parte, Erik Prince, el nuevo héroe de la oposición venezolana, llegó justo en los días en el que el ex candidato a la presidencia, Edmundo González Urrutia, abandonó el país hacia España, gracias a la aprobación de un salvoconducto otorgado por el Ejecutivo Nacional, dejando huérfana a la oposición y además se deslindó de cualquier movimiento que pretenda desestabilizar la paz en Venezuela. ¿Por qué Venezuela?, se preguntarán. Sin embargo, estas publicaciones de Prince comenzaron a convertirse en tendencia en redes sociales al utilizar las frases como un movimiento imparable ha comenzado en Venezuela. Sugirieron que la gestión del presidente legítimo Nicolás Maduro está a punto de enfrentar una transformación radical. Las palabras "se acabó el juego" y "esta vez será distinto" resuenan como una clara amenaza de desestabilización más que al gobierno, al pueblo venezolano. Existen más pruebas de esta nueva trama cargada de violencia que se cocina en la ultraderecha regional. De hecho, se intensificó cuando el fascista venezolano Iván Simonovic reveló que Erik Prince había tenido una reunión con el presidente salvadoreño Nayib Bukele hace aproximadamente un mes. Y por otra parte, este prófugo de la justicia añadió que hay que tener paciencia y esperar el momento para actuar, mas nunca dormirán en paz. La empresa Blackwater se creó para evitar investigaciones del Congreso de Estados Unidos. Era mejor privatizar los horribles actos de asesinatos, torturas y masacres que no eran recomendable que las hicieran las fuerzas oficiales. Pero, ¿qué vio este personaje en Venezuela que de repente lo hizo amenazar al gobierno nacional de Nicolás Maduro Moros? Pues lo mismo lo mismo que su amigo Elon Musk. Recursos naturales, energéticos y minerales en cantidad del pueblo venezolano. Para ello, estos multimillonarios representan un nuevo tipo de colonialismo corporativo que trata de apoderarse de un país a través de las empresas que se instalan y explotan los recursos sin retribuir nada a cambio y por lo tanto terminan influyendo en su vida tanto política y social en Venezuela. También cuando se trata de Venezuela, hay algunos organismos que se niegan a pronunciarse o a condenar cuando el objetivo es violento y descaradamente desestabilizador o si mercenarios insinúan que cometerán un magnicidio. Así ocurrió cuando el dueño de la empresa de seguro militar gringa privada más grande del mundo, Blackwater, dijo en su cuenta de la red social X, antiguamente Twitter, que se eleva la recompensa a $100 millones por Nicolás Maduro, Diosdado Cabello y todo su régimen. Solo tienen que sentarse y esperar que suceda la magia. Justamente de esto se trata de Erik Prince, el asesino a sueldo del imperio, quien se encarga de llamar a los asesinos y mercenarios del mundo a atentar contra la vida del presidente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro Moros. ¿Qué pasaría si el escenario estuviera invertido y desde Venezuela se pusiera precio en la cabeza de algún mandatario político estadounidense? Su único objetivo y lo que más les interesa es adueñarse de los recursos del país y con tal descaro lo proponen. Incluso se pueden pagar con dineros congelados del régimen que ya se encuentra en los bancos estadounidenses. Esto lo destaca en el post del dueño de Blackwater, Erik Prince, el ex militar y empresario. También el embajador representante permanente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela ante la ONU, Samuel Moncada, destacó en un post de su cuenta en X: en Venezuela la lucha es contra el fascismo mundial y la clara mayoría de nuestro pueblo está dispuesto a dar la batalla por nuestra independencia. Bien, amigos de El Búnker Digital, justamente esta es la noticia que se ha presentado en este momento, donde recalcamos que Erik Prince ha dado este anuncio importante en esta entrevista dado por Anthony Pomplino, donde se trató distintos temas y más concretamente el tema de Venezuela y de Nicolás Maduro. Bueno, no se olviden dejar sus opiniones abajo en los comentarios que los estaremos leyendo. Muchas gracias por su sintonía y preferencia. Esto ha sido El Búnker Digital, un lugar seguro de información.